Well, I'd like to thank Mandy, Shireen, and the Kenyon Institute for hosting me tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I see some familiar faces in the audience, so I'm glad those people I know have made the effort to come here. And I'm even more pleased that people I don't know are also here, so that's great. As Mandy was saying, I'm here to talk about my new book, which is called Intimate Enemies. It's a short work. It's like novella length, and it's actually like an adaptation of a longer work which will come out next year, which goes into much greater depth and detail. Basically, the reason I call it Intimate Enemies, well, first of all, the rationale behind it. The reason I decided to embark on this book is because for multiple motivations. One is that I feel that there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings that need to be remedied and tackled. Another reason is I think that a lot of the available literature focuses on the politics, the history, the conflict, but there is not so much that actually focuses on the people, the human lives at stake in this conflict, and certainly not that much that focuses on both sides of the equation, that introduces both peoples. So this is my effort to look at this human dimension. So that's basically the background behind it. It's part of a journey that started for me back in 2007 when I first came to visit here. And I came to visit here partly because I'd been writing about here for a number of years, but I'd never actually seen the situation on the ground, and I found that unsatisfactory. It was a big step for me as an Egyptian and an Arab to come here for various reasons and complications that Shireen is well aware of. But I'm glad I have. It's enriched my understanding, and it's helped me, I think, deepen my writing and my ability to deal with the situation, and also like it's introduced me to lots of very, very interesting and people, and I've had some very memorable experiences being here. Okay, so I had a lot. I couldn't figure out which extract to read. After a lot of toing and froing and soul searching, I decided instead of reading an excerpt from the actual book that's available, I will read something from the book that's to come, because I figure that, some of you may have already read what's been published, and also this is perhaps a little bit more appropriate for the context, in that it's an extract from the chapter on Jerusalem. It's a short excerpt that I'm going to read from the chapter on Jerusalem. Before we move on to the politics, like the end of the book, I deal with a kind of a proposed vision for a way forward. So the extra I'm going to read about Jerusalem is from the chapter on Jerusalem, and I'm going to read about a bit about the old city. Okay. So, although Jerusalem has grown massively over the past century or so, especially since the Israeli conquest of 1967, its soul still lies within the walls rebuilt by Solomon. Not the Solomon, son of David of Old Testament fame, but the magnificent Ottoman Sultan. Unusually for modern times, Jerusalem's beautiful white limestone walls, whose functional defensive purpose has long become obsolete, still stand fully intact. Fully intact, that is, except for the breach in the wall made beside the Jaffa Gate in 1898, to allow the German Emperor Wilhelm II to enter the old city mounted on his white steed. And following in the footsteps of emperors, I too used that bridge regularly while living in Jerusalem. In the old city, within the space of a few hundred meters, you can stroll between the holiest sites of the three monotheistic religions in a kind of short distance leap of faith. Within 5 minutes, you can go from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre along the Via Dolorosa, down El Wed, the western wall, which is actually a supporting wall of the Haram al-Sharif, or sacred sanctuary as Muslims call it, or Temple Mount as it's known to Jews, with the sublime dome of the rock dominating the skylight, its 24-carat finery glittering above. During my original visit, I had not come to Palestine and Israel for tourism, and given my godlessness, I had certainly not come as a pilgrim, though I was on a sort of political pilgrimage. Still, I could not resist spending some time wandering the old city of age-worn white stone, with its atmospheric maze of narrow streets, climbing up and down the various hills upon which the town is built. The visitor is often afforded unexpectedly breathtaking views over the rooftops of spires, minarets, domes, and homes. And in some parts of the city, you can actually walk over the rooftops while surveying the skyline. The sacred and profane mix and mingle everywhere and can be seen hanging out together, mingling, if not always mixing, on every corner. Christian pilgrims singing hymns, some bearing crosses, follow slowly and somberly in Christ's footsteps, seeking out the stations of Jesus' crucifixion among the shops along the Via Dolorosa, the way of grief, while shoppers and other pedestrians push impatiently past the traffic jam with the faithful. More than any other figure, Jesus is everywhere in the old city. In addition to the many stationed Via Dolorosa, which leads to the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ is believed to have been crucified, many of Jesus' haunts and hangouts can still be visited today. These include the room, the cenacle, where he and his disciples are supposed to have consumed the Last Supper. Though even if the location is correct, the chamber's rib-vaulted Gothic architecture is certainly something Christ would not have witnessed. During my residence in Jerusalem, I witnessed the second, third, fourth, fifth coming of Christ. One incarnation was particularly eye-catching. The past 2 millennia had not been kind to him. Dressed in a white toga and trademark Jesus creepers with a woolen blanket draped over one shoulder, his iconically slim figure had piled on the pounds. His long brown hair was streaked with grey, and his progress through the streets did not elicit the slightest interest, neither from locals nor even pilgrims. After a couple of years of spotting him in the distance, one time I mustered up the resolve to approach him and ask if I could take his photo, though I failed to ask him for an autograph. It was during a landmark visit of Pope Francis to the Holy Land in May 2004, when he, among other things, prayed at the Israeli separation wall, invited Netanyahu and Abbas to join him in prayer at the Vatican, and paid his respects at Yad Vashem. I enjoyed seeing the Pope in Bethlehem yesterday, the Jesus figure told me, proving that the meek truly are blessed, even if they haven't inherited the earth. I am a devout Christian, but also a Jew at heart. I doubt this Christ Tribute Act was the Antichrist so many are awaiting, or El-Dajjal as he's known to Muslims, as he seemed far too lonely and harmless to be the embodiment of evil and was hardly worth Christ's or the Mahdi's time to descend all the way from heaven to reveal him as a false prophet. He was obviously just a poor lost soul suffering from the famous, if contested, Jerusalem syndrome. Strangely enough, or perhaps unsurprisingly given the historical significance, buying nails in the old city is no mean feat, and a weirdly eerie notion. We needed to hang a few things up, and no one in our immediate neighborhood of East Jerusalem sold nails. Instead of heading off to a nearby industrial zone, I decided I'd try my luck within the city's walls. After some snooping and asking around, I located a small shop which sold the said item, nestled between the Jewish and the Muslims' quarters. Jerusalemites mix in unexpected fashions. To avoid inter-Christian rivalries from escalating, the keys of the Holy Sepulchre have been held by Muslim custodians for centuries, while Muslim hawkers rent out crosses to Christian pilgrims, and Muslim artisans even churn out crowns of thorns for Christian pilgrims. Likewise, Muslim and Christian Palestinian merchants don't let their religion or nationality get in the way of business. They sell Christian and Jewish souvenirs, from fluorescent crosses and icons to kippahs and Jewish prayer shawls, and Israeli-themed T-shirts. However, despite this low-level interaction, Jerusalem is largely divided along nationalistic lines, as well as along intra-religious lines, with the city's growing Orthodox Jewish population muscling out the secular Jews of the city. Today, Jewish and Arab Jerusalemites rarely mix and live uncomfortably parallel but overlapping lives. The tensions are especially apparent on Fridays and during religious holidays, when mosques pump up the volume as if in protest at the regular restrictions imposed on young Palestinian men praying at Al-Aqsa, or perhaps to put the fear of God into the thousands of Haredi Jews who race towards the Western Wall. Once upon a time, the different faith communities used to live side by side, were often friends and shared one another's festivals. In fact, the mutual suspicion has become such that it took me a while to accustom myself to the questioning, sometimes hostile looks I would get as each tried to figure out which side I belonged to. It wasn't always like this. Although Jerusalem has suffered from regular periods of intolerance, its residents once enjoyed one another's holidays. During the Ottoman era, for example, a carnival outside the old city's walls to mark the festival of Eid at the end of Ramadan was attended by Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, where they enjoyed fairground rides, horse races, Arab sweets, and apparently even peep shows. Likewise, Muslims and Christians dressed up in Jewish costumes to celebrate the flamboyant Jewish festival of Purim. The old city's fashion catwalk is like a trip through time back to radically different eras. Perspiring Jewish men in black suits, sometimes covered with a dandy frock coat and wide-brim hats, dressed like religious gangsters from the 1930s or Eastern European clerks from the 19th century, rushed past perspiring Muslim women, also dressed in medieval black, apparently always running late for their appointments with God. Russian nuns in hijabs and Palestinian women in habits pass one another coyly and demurely, not to mention a growing number of Haredi women who dress in hijab-like outfits and even a full face veil in the ultra-Orthodox Mea Shearim neighborhood, just outside the old city's walls. Truly proving their reputation as men of the cloth, Christian priests display perhaps the greatest diversity in time and place in their fashion parade. Bling-bling crosses, black bandanas, Anglican dog collars, Franciscan habits, and more. Some even glide through the old city quite literally like caped crusaders, well, at least caped priests, though they themselves are not superheroes, but merely representatives of the supreme being. Beards and skull caps abound among all three faiths, with slight differences in style, a jealously guarded way of standing apart. And for those of us who believed that because people of faith are ascetics, or who apparently eschew fashion, they save a fortune on their wardrobe, think again. Although a kippah can be purchased for a few shekels, a decent quality felt hat can cost hundreds of dollars, with a fur strimmel, how do you say it, strimmel, is that right? Strimmel, thank you, can cost thousands, depending on the type of animal skin in its manufacture. That might explain why so many Haredi and Hasidic men take such pride in protecting their headwear against rain and snow by placing ugly, tight-fitting plastic bags on top. The religious gangster look doesn't come cheap, obviously. When more than 300,000 Haredi shut down Jerusalem to protest draft legislation that will force more of them to undergo compulsory military service, I was distracted from the heated public debate this issue raised in Israel, with musings over how much their collective headgear must be worth. Unlike with secularists, men's attire generally costs more than women's in ultra-Orthodox circles. The exception to this is what's the wig called? The shaitel? Shaitel, thank you. The wig worn by married religious women. For the fashion-conscious Haredi woman, a natural-looking wig made of virgin hair, usually sourced from Asia, can cost up to $4,500. Then there is shaitel in the city, where well-heeled Manhattan Jewish women mind-bogglingly spend as much as $1,600 to have their wigs coiffed. How are we doing for time? Okay. It felt like forever. Okay. So, before I go on to read the future vision, I'll read another extract from the longer work. Of course, like this is still relatively a work in progress, so it'll be still sliced and diced and edited further, but this is how it stands at the moment. So this is an extract that's one person in the room will relate to, Shireen. It's called Talk Like an Egyptian. Okay. So when I was growing up, the 1986 Bangles hit, Walk Like an Egyptian, was, for the duration of a few endless months, my musical tormentor and persecutor, pursuing me wherever I went like a bad dream. Displaying a supreme sense of repetitive, closed-loop originality, friends and schoolmates would mockingly break into sand dances when they encountered me, before rapidly breaking down into fits of writhing laughter. Though I found it funny to start with, it got terribly wearying after a while. To stop this phenomenon in its tracks, at least at school, I decided to beat them by joining them. Although I'd never thought of taking part in a talent show before, partly because it seemed uncool, and also because I didn't have any performing talents I was aware of, I signed up for the contest nonetheless. Wrapped up in standard issue 80s school toilet paper, I strutted my sandy stuff on a stage as a property of the council mummy. At the end of the number, with the loo roll already slipping precariously, I toted it off as my finale. It worked a treat. No one danced like an Egyptian anymore. If the Bangles really wanted to learn what distinguishes an Egyptian, I invite them to come to the Holy Land to find out. It is not how an Egyptian walks, but how he or she talks that makes them stand out. On the street, I blend in quite ambiguously, at least when I'm without Iskander and Kathleen, my wife, and my son, with both Palestinians and Israelis confusing me as one of their own, or suspecting I'm from the other side. But no sooner have I opened my mouth than matters change when it comes to Palestinian interlocutors. "You're Egyptian," comes a startled or thrilled or delighted or inevitable rhetorical question. Then, more often than not, I'm interrogated about what I'm doing here, what I think of the place, how it compares to Egypt, and the latest political developments back home. Even in Abu Ghosh, Israel's hummus capital, which once held the world record for the world's largest chickpea delight, we were almost mobbed by adoring locals. Despite the reputation of the picturesque village, which is named for a clan of Circassian descent, of being the most friendly Arab town to the state of Israel and popular with Jews, this does not make the locals any less fascinated with Egypt. Everyone we encountered on our first visit was pleased to have an Egyptian in their midst. It almost seemed like everyone we ran into loved Egypt or had been there but stopped going out of concern for the security situation. Although some Palestinians see a lack of loyalty in Abu Ghosh's friendly ties with Israel and pre-state Zionism, Abu Ghoshites see this as a manifestation of their traditional Arab hospitality. We witnessed this in a constant stream of invitations to coffee or tea we received. In trouble spots in particular, I am made to feel especially welcome. For instance, people in embattled Hebron regularly express their pleasure and gratitude for my presence. We're so glad that an Egyptian has come to see for himself what we have to endure, I've heard on numerous occasions. We feel forgotten. The novelty of my presence can sometimes lead to surreal situations in which the tables are turned, and I become the interviewee rather than the interviewer. For instance, this occurred in Nabi Samuel, the tiny village caught in limbo between Israeli-annexed Jerusalem and the West Bank, which has been cut off from the outside world by Israeli settlements and a national park, and is under constant military surveillance. Perched attractively on a hilltop visible from East Jerusalem, it is reportedly the vantage point where the Crusaders of the First Crusade, at the end of the 11th century, first glimpsed Jerusalem. I had come to the community and to interview Muhammad Barakat, a local lawyer and spokesperson for the village who, being a paraplegic, obviously did not have it easy in such an isolated and ill-equipped location. Though I had come to hear about Nabi Samuel's suffering, a significant chunk of my visit was spent debating Egyptian politics with Barakat and his brother, both of whom happened to be Nasserists. In fact, Gamal Abdel Nasser remains a popular figure in Palestine, despite the catastrophic decisions he took on behalf of the Palestinians, and I've had long conversations with Bedouins on the Jerusalem periphery, at risk of eviction, and residents in other threatened communities across the West Bank, on Nasser and all things Egyptian. Sometimes I attempt to be incognito by doing my best impersonation of a Palestinian dialect. but any extended exchange soon betrays my roots. I just can't insert enough extra vowels into my speech, and I sometimes strip up on the vocab, using a telltale Egyptian word or expression. As a sign of respect for the local culture and an effort to integrate, I try to use the Palestinian dialect or weave my speech with Palestinianisms, producing a strange hybrid. When I do this, I often find myself in a bizarre situation in which I'm trying to speak like a native, while the native is trying to talk like an Egyptian. Actually, Palestinians would rather I didn't speak their dialect, and not out of any sense of misplaced Puritanism or patriotism or condescension, quite the contrary. They would much rather I spoke Egyptian because of the sense of glamour they associate with it. Because the only Egyptian dialect, well actually it's Cairean, they hear tends to be on TV, in films or in music. Palestinians often feel that a character of a film set somehow walked off screen and entered the stage of life right in front of them. After a decade of relative inconspicuousness in the anonymous public spheres of Northern Europe, it felt strange to be greeted like a minor B-list celebrity, even though I can't act and have only done a tiny amount of dramatics in my life. I love Egypt, or I love Egyptians, is something I hear repeatedly, ever since I first visited in 2007, by young and old, men and even women, the higher barriers between intergender interactions here compared with the West. Children are particularly susceptible to this allure. Have you met or do you know such and such a star? Are questions I'm regularly asked by kids, such as a group who surrounded me at a Jerusalem playground. Of course, I was there with my son. I wasn't there hanging out with the kids, just in case anyone gets the wrong end of the stick.
We need to write it down.
The assumption that only on the strength of being one of 85 million Egyptians I would have access to A-list celebrities cannot only but bring a smile to my face. On the other edge of the age spectrum, Palestinians are also enamored of Egyptians. Khalil, our nonagenarian neighbor, never tired of telling me how much she loved Egyptians and Egyptian culture, often reminiscing about the golden age of Egyptian art and how top Egyptian celebrities would visit the Palestine of her youth. And it's not because you're an Egyptian that I say that, she insisted. You Egyptians are so funny and have a light spirit. She obviously doesn't know me so well. This overwhelmingly enthusiastic sentiment has boggled my mind, given all Egypt's imperfections and problems. But in a way, it is these very faults and challenges, and a dramatic way Egyptians can engage with them, that adds to Egypt's dramatic appeal in these parts. Palestinian reactions and questions often acted as a barometer of the political situation back home. During my first visit, the sentiment was Egyptians are great, shame about your politicians. When we first moved here in April 2011, the Egyptian revolution had recently erupted, leading to the downfall of Mubarak but leaving the body of his regime intact. Palestinians back then were ecstatic, and their joy bordered on that experienced by Egyptians. As the months wore on and the army refused to cede power, the initial euphoria damped down. When the Islamists gained control of parliament and Mohamed Morsi rose to the presidency, secularists were downhearted. When the Muslim Brotherhood started to screw around, even Islamists were baffled. And when we returned at the end of 2003, after the removal of Morsi and during the continued crackdown on the Brotherhood, Palestinian onlookers had reached a state of despair. But still, the glamour effect of talking like an Egyptian lives on, and probably will do so until the day, if it ever comes, when large numbers of Egyptians start coming here, and people discover that we are not all film stars, political activists, or intellectuals, like they have found out in neighboring Jordan, where there are lots of Egyptians, mostly poor laborers and farmers, who are often treated with contempt. Okay, I think I'll stop there because I don't want to bore you. So, all right. So I don't know how best to proceed. Shall I already read about, or is that too much reading? Shall I already read the thing about the vision, or shall we talk about what I've spoken about already, briefly? Or
Maybe go on to the vision, because I think that will bring out what it is you're trying to do with this book.
All right.
I'm a bit intrigued for you to explain a little bit more about what you mean by intimate enemies.
In the debate, or now already?
Just in general, because I'm a little bit lost as to where you're going.
Okay, well, what do I mean by the term intimate enemies, you mean? Well, intimate enemies because, firstly, both sides in general consider themselves to be enemies. There are exceptions, but in general, both sides consider themselves to be enemies. Intimate because because of the close physical and geographic proximity between the two sides, which is something that is not driven home fully until you actually live here. When we first moved here, we lived in Sharafat. Sharafat is only a stone's throw away from 3 or 4 different Israeli settlements, for instance, or you've got Piskat Zayev is right next door to Beit Hanina, things like that. So there's that geographic proximity and overlap. There's also the intimacy in the sense that the more I live here and the more I learn about the two peoples and the more I analyze, the more I realize that actually the two sides collectively have much more in common than either side is aware or would like to admit, and that actually the differences within each society are greater than the differences between them on a cultural and social level. Politically, of course, that's a different matter, but on a cultural and social level, I feel that there's a lot more divergence within each identity group than there is between them. That's my personal interpretation of the situation. So that's what intimate enemies kind of encompasses as a term.
I don't know, would people prefer it just to be a conversation, or would you...
It's
the excerpt that I read that I was really fascinated by was when you were talking about the Mizrahi, and that to me brought out some of the problems with just defining it as two sides sometimes.
Exactly, yeah.
And the Arab culture amongst the Mizrahis,
and
how that was suppressed. I found that excerpt really fascinating, and for me that was what I was interested to hear you talk about.
Okay.
About the way that there's different boundaries that we don't consider when we look at this place. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Sure. I mean, I've got that extract with me. But basically, I've got a whole chapter in the book which I call, conflicting identities, in which I focus on 2 main groups, the Mizrahi Jews, so Jews from the Middle East originally, and on Palestinian citizens of Israel, who I feel that, they're sort of caught in the middle between, in terms of their identities between the two sides. So the Mizrahi Jews, it's quite interesting. I take an intergenerational view, how, the first generation who came here tried to sort of erase their Arab and sort of Middle Eastern identity and to sort of become part of the melting pot, and how the later generations, the current generations, are taking a lot more pride in their culture and in their heritage. This doesn't translate necessarily politically. It doesn't mean they're politically friendlier towards Arabs. On the contrary, some of the most conservative views towards the Arab world will be in Mizrahi circles. But I see that as a positive first step by reclaiming their cultural identity that can, in the future, potentially act as a kind of bridge. And at the moment, they're straddling a chasm. But in the future, they could also act as a kind of bridge. So, I look at different Mizrahi Jews I spoke to and I read about and so on. So one fascinating example is Sassoon Somekh, who's an academic and a poet and a writer, and he spent his early formative years in Baghdad, which was a very Jewish city back then. At least a third of the population was Jewish, and he left there as a teenager when the Jews were given the option of, to stay and face mounting, persecution, or to leave and renounce everything, give up their property, give up their lives, and just leave with a suitcase. So in the case of Iraq, where during World War II there'd been a lot of tensions, most Jews were afraid and they decided to leave. But in Somech's case, he tries to show that this wasn't the whole picture. He shows that how in leftist and communist circles, they were still very pro-Jewish, and that, for example, the Iraqi Communist Party believed that nationalism was just a passing phase, and that one day the proletariat in Israel and Palestine and the proletariat in Iraq and so on would unite and throw off the oppressive bourgeois nationalism and so on. So, and Somech has led a very interesting life. He became very close friends with Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian Nobel laureate, and he was actually the leading authority on Naguib Mahfouz as an academic when he was studying, I think, at Oxford University in the 60s. And it was actually his thesis, which was, at the time, the Nobel Committee was considering Mahfouz's work. I think his thesis was the only in-depth study in English of Mahfouz's works. So Mahfouz told Somech much later that if it hadn't been for him, he probably wouldn't have got the Nobel Prize. So their relationship was a very interesting one. It was actually a correspondence for many years until, following the peace treaty, Somech rushed to visit Egypt and fulfill a childhood dream, because he'd grown up reading Taha Hussein and all these Egyptian writers. And for him, like, the Nile was sort of etched into his head like the Tigris. And so, like, for him, it was a dream come true to be in Cairo. And he finally met Naguib Mahfouz when he went in the early 80s, and he lived there for a stretch in the 90s, and they became very close friends. So it's the Arab-Jew dichotomy is in reality much more complex than people today allow. The idea that Arab and Jew are two mutually exclusive identities is something that previously didn't exist. There was a time when you could be both. Like one Iraqi Jewish intellectual said, like, we felt more Arab than the Arabs. So yeah. So just as identities have been recalibrated and redefined, to suit the sort of like the polarization of the conflict, they can be also, in my view, reimagined in the future.
Do you want to now go on to talk about how you reimagine bringing these
Okay.
together? And then I think that would be the basis for us to have a discussion.
Yeah. Because the short book is mostly about, the people, the vision, which I elaborate much more in the longer version, is actually like just a few pages. So I'll go through it quickly. So, with Gaza in ruins, the West Bank in turmoil, and Israelis divided and insecure, it is tempting to think there is no way out of this conflict, that the downward spiral will continue indefinitely. I too share this sense of despondency and despair, especially since the overflowing of tensions that started in the summer of 2014. The two-state solution, which in my view has lost the race against space to the mushrooming settlements, died years ago. Yet the Palestinian Authority and many liberal Israelis continue to believe in it. And I quote here, "This is a conflict between two national movements over a piece of territory, and the accepted solution to the conflict since 1937 has been partition," maintains veteran Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin. And despite the repeated failure of partition, Baskin believes, quote, "the solution is on the table waiting to be picked up, but for the lack of leadership. Others who were once staunch advocates of the two-state option, especially amongst Palestinians, have given up hope. I think the two-state I quote again, "I think this two-state solution can only be revived if the Israelis evacuate the settlements," observed Ziad Abu Zayed, who was earlier involved in many of the key negotiations which led to the 1993 Oslo Accords, which was supposed to set a comprehensive framework for the resolution of the conflict and to the creation of the Palestinian Authority. Quote, "But I am doubtful there is a leader in Israel who would dare to abandon the settlements. Although Palestinians and Israelis live in a de facto single state, though a largely segregated one, few Israelis wish to admit this." Here I quote again, "The one-state solution cannot just be the choice of one side. Even if the Palestinians want a single state, The Israelis must want it too, notes Abu Zayyad, who is the co-founder of the joint Palestine-Israel Journal, a periodical written by pro-peace stakeholders from both sides. Even though the single-state option is more popular amongst Palestinians, a growing minority of Israelis support it. I quote here, "I believe in a one-state solution as the only just and functional settlement for the conflict," Ilan Pappé said. "Anyone who's more than 5 minutes on the ground in the West Bank realizes there is no space there for an independent Palestinian state." As someone who is averse to ethno-nationalism and as a strong believer in multiculturalism, the idea of a single state is appealing. But I'm also a realist and realize that in the context of such fear and distrust, not to mention a long history of oppression the two peoples have suffered, the allure of independence and national self-determination, even when it is illusionary, is overpowering. But there is a way to combine the two, a single state with the bells and whistles of nationhood, a federal or confederated state. This could draw inspiration from the Belgian model, in which there would be a non-geographical community governments for Arabs and Jews, and possibly a joint one for those who opt out of ethnic definitions, and a federal government for issues of common interest and concern. However, talking of a one- or two-state solution, or even alliance of city-states, is premature. What we urgently need are strategies to help move us towards a state of justice. It is my conviction that we need to pursue an incremental path forward and adopt what I call the non-state solution. Instead of the current fixation on borders and territories, as if soil is so much thicker than blood, the focus must shift to the people. Prioritizing the people will necessitate transforming the Palestinian struggle into a mass, non-violent civil rights movement. Under this model, Palestinians will deploy all the tools of peaceful resistance that they have constructed and utilized over the years, including non-violent protests, civil disobedience, strikes, and targeted boycotts. But given the sacrifices Palestinians have made for the cause of national independence, many are reluctant or even hostile for now towards the idea of a civil rights struggle. I quote here, "The conflict will be transformed from a struggle for a nation to a struggle for civil rights and human rights once Palestinians understand that there is no hope left for a state," contends Abu Zayyad. These rights, in my view, include the freedom to travel, work, and reside everywhere, not just in Palestine, but also in Israel. The removal of roadblocks and checkpoints, the dismantling of the wall cutting through the West Bank. Another vital but difficult plank is the enfranchisement of the Palestinians of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza through full citizenship. Meanwhile, Israeli sympathizers will force emancipation platforms on their political parties and engage in co-resistance. This approach is anathema to most Israelis, even on the left, who tend to see it as spelling the end of Israel as a Jewish state, or a way of creating a single state by stealth. However, a growing number are recognizing the dangers involved in the untenable status quo and are calling for civil rights. The solution is to break the occupation into pieces. I quote here. "The solution is to break the occupation into pieces and deal with each one of them," wrote independent journalist Noam Sheizaf. These pieces of peace include the military court system and administrative detentions, he contends. Forging a people's peace. The non-state solution doesn't actually determine the final form of borders or the character of the states, but on the contrary can potentially empower the citizenry rather than the political class to forge a solution which most appeals to them. Once disenfranchisement has ended and everyone is an equal citizen, then a binational conversation can commence to reach gradually a final settlement through a people's peace process. Any Israeli or Palestinian should be free to propose initiatives and suggest actions. Any proposals that garner enough initial support should then be voted on by the Israeli and Palestinian publics. Any measure for which the majority on both sides vote should be implemented immediately to create positive momentum. Away from the false us and them divisions forced on the two populations, this process will enable each individual to go with his or her conscience and aspirations, and not be coerced into groupthink or group action. Israel's Palestinian citizens and Arab Mizrahi Jews can potentially play a bridging role in this regard. Eventual conciliation can also help them to take true pride in their multiple identities and provide a prototype for a new citizen who traverses the old divides. Ultimately, Israelis and Palestinians may decide that they cannot live together and settle on a velvet divorce. Alternatively, the two sides may decide that they actually like each other and have more in common than they once believed. Whatever they choose, peace will only come when people are held in higher regard than the land and are empowered to pursue a peace of the people, by the people, and for the people.